the GOP bench is much deeper than the Democratic bench here. It's basically Hillary or bust among Democrats. I was also surprised at how well Jeb Bush and Chris Christie are doing. In Republican circles, there are deal-breaker issues there, supposedly on immigration with Jeb Bush and on, moderation on climate change and gun control with Chris Christie. Voters seem to be telling pollsters otherwise, which is interesting.
Last hour, my commentary focused on a poll this week that asked about who people would vote for if they could redo the 2012 election. Seeing as I spoke personally with Mandrake the Magician, Dr. Strange, and even Captain James Tiberius Kirk about this possibility and came to the conclusion it can never actually happen, my conclusion was that certain people need to move on and deal with what can actually really happen instead of flights of science fiction fancy. It's germane because certain people need to grasp reality and take into account what the future really holds and how to best address that future. Let's get to it. Welcome into the arena, conservative strategist Jimmy LaSalvia and political columnist and commentator for the Tea Party News Network, Scottie Nell Hughes. Thank you so much for joining us, everybody.
Hi, Ed.
Thank you.
All right, here we go. Let's get right to it. Jimmy, I'm going to give you the first shot on this one here today, seeing as you now are at the bottom of the screen, so let's start there. I was the one who said that it is time to stop thinking about Mitt Romney for 2016. Come on, Republicans, move on here. There's got to be a future in here. Isn't that all part of this whole change here that the Republicans need to work on, or else they're just going to continue to get stuck in the same old mud?
Right. One of the things that I cited several months ago when I decided to leave the Republican Party and work outside of the party was that I really think that there is a cultural disconnect among Republicans, the Republican establishment and party activists, and the American people just don't think that Republicans are living in reality or living in America today. And we saw that in the last presidential election when people thought Mitt Romney was old-fashioned or out of touch. And, while we had a failed president, Republicans couldn't beat him with a good manager, with a good economic plan, because voters just didn't think the Republican Party and Mitt Romney was living in reality in 2012.
All right.
And so we've got to move beyond that so that, they can hopefully maybe win again in the future.
Let's go ahead and stop there now. Scottie Nell, it's to you. Living in reality, indeed. Is that the biggest problem the Republicans have?
I think both sides could say that neither party's living in reality. Washington, D.C. is not the same thing as what's going on in Oklahoma City or Tulsa or any other Midwestern city. But I think it's not necessarily talking about their policies and going maybe more realistic, or is what some might define as realistic when it comes to social agendas. It's talking about how do we sit here and pay for $5.32 for a gallon of milk? And how do I handle $4 a gallon to fill up my SUV? That's the reality that they need to face, that I don't know if we'll ever be able to convince the politicians in D.C. to be able to handle, as long as we're sitting there and we're allowing career politicians to be elected and put back in office.
Yeah,
and that's on both sides of the aisle, not just Republicans.
Don't the politicians have to tell the people and make the people understand and at least try to convince them that we're the ones to be able to do this? We're the ones who actually will tell you the truth. We're the ones who are part of the change here. They don't seem thus far to be able to get that message across.
Well, they're not doing a very good job with that. But I'm here in the state of Tennessee where right now, Lamar Alexander, who is a perfect example of a career politician, he has been in politics literally, I think, since 18. And all of a sudden, he's put back on, when he comes back to Tennessee, he puts back on his flannel shirt and he decides to take a bus tour or walk back across the state. That is their idea of being able to sell it to the people of Tennessee. And guess what? It works because he continues to get reelected. But when he goes back up to Washington, D.C., his votes are anything like the people he represents. It's all about who has the better PR firm, the better PR advisors. And unfortunately, on the campaign trail, the people who are the most realistic and telling the honest truth, those are the guys that don't get the money, that don't get the people behind them, and unfortunately are the ones that continue to lose.
Jimmy, here we go. That evolved adapt or die. It seems like what happens is you just go ahead, you show up home for a little while, show back in Washington. There's no consistency.
Well, what Scottie is talking about is Lamar showing that he's connected and culturally connected. Because frankly, nobody cares what your plan is for taxes and jobs if they don't think that your plan is based in reality. So he's doing a good PR thing there by showing that he is living in reality. But Scottie hits on a great point there. America is fed up with the parties, and the parties have existed to perpetuate their own power. And so most Americans today are asking themselves, who am I going to vote for in November? Am I going to vote for a Senate candidate who's going to vote for Mitch McConnell for majority leader, or Harry Reid for majority leader? Am I going to replace one out-of-touch old white guy who got us into this mess for another guy, exactly the same? And so Scottie hit on a great point, and I think that Republicans are in a weaker position, not in the midterms, but nationally for 2016 because of their disconnect on cultural issues. But in the overall scheme of things, we've got to look at reforming the process so that these parties don't continue their stranglehold on our government and the process.
All right, Scottie Nell, a weaker position for 2016, you agree?
I agree right now, and unfortunately, I believe that if we held the election tomorrow, that if Hillary Clinton was at the top of the Democratic ticket, unless you have somebody as exactly opposite of her, like a Ted Cruz, we would be in trouble. And Mitt Romney versus Hillary Clinton, we would need to start redecorating the Oval Office with roses and pink tulip border. I think we would be having to usher her in. But a really good point is, I don't know necessarily if it's the social issues that are not necessarily allowing the Republican to relate. I think it is that the establishment, those old guard, those ones that continue, they are so protective of themselves. They are willing to put their own integrity ahead, the Republican Party integrity ahead of what's actually good for the people.
Okay, didn't you just say then they're more interested in their paycheck? Isn't that what it comes down to?
That's exactly what it is. They're more interested in keeping themselves in office than doing what's good for the country. You know, I think these guys go to Washington. I like to think they went up there with good intentions originally back in the 1800s when some of them went up there for the first time. But unfortunately, they've stayed there too long. They've patrolled the halls of Congress with the other cockroaches, and they've evolved into people that do not exist. And unfortunately, in the case of Lamar Alexander, putting on a flannel shirt doesn't always really work for those of us. But he's got a great PR turn.
I am going to say one thing, though. I think that if you put some people into that sentence, you just insulted some cockroaches, but we're not going to talk about the people that you may or may not have been talking about there.
Right.
There is a moment here. Hang on, Jimmy. You always got to be careful of the following joke after that one. Let's move on to what Rand Paul has said. Rand Paul seems to be going after what some people are considering a conservatarian line, that in order for the conservatives, in order for Republicans to thrive, they need to bring the libertarians in a little bit closer here. He seems to have a lot of success with it. Certainly when he visited Northern California, he had an awful lot of people saying that he was the guy that they might actually consider. So is that what we're talking about here? Bring the libertarians into it a little more?
Well, I think that there can be agreement on the role of government on a lot of issues. We might disagree on the outcome of the issue, but we can find agreement where we can say the government shouldn't have a role in that. I will say that Rand Paul talks out of both sides of his mouth, though. He has, on one side, tried to portray himself as a libertarian, and on another side, he does things like sponsor the conference next week in Iowa, sponsored by the Family Leader Organization, which is an organization that exists to oppose homosexuality and demonize gay people, something that is far outside the mainstream. But one thing I'll just go back to something we said before was to demonstrate just how out of touch the establishment is. A lot of us read the email that the RNC sent out last week that asked, have you abandoned the GOP? And the backlash that they received from that, from activists and grassroots conservatives, should tell you everything you need to know about the state of the Republican Party.
And to be fair on that, to point out exactly what that was basically a look for donations. That was asking for money.
Right. And they asked, have you abandoned the GOP? And the backlash was essentially, yes. And you haven't done anything to show that we should come back. And, you know, when they should have been issuing an apology. We're sorry. We've strayed. We need your help to make things right again.
Okay, I'm almost out of time, Jimmy. I got to stop. Now, let me give you 30 seconds real quick and stay to it. What's the first step the Republicans need to do from here?
Oh,
it's
gosh.
Hang on 1 sec, Scottie. Jimmy first. Go ahead.
Yeah, I think there's 100 different things they need to do. And first and foremost is to step back on the anti-gay stuff. I think it crosses all demographics and hurts them badly.
All right, Scottie Nell Hughes, you got 30 seconds. First thing they got to do right now.
It's not about social issues. Let's get back to the founding principles that separates the Republicans from the Democrats. That's called responsible spending. We can all sit there and debate social issues till we go blue. If we don't have money in our pocket, then we don't have anything to talk about. We need to get our economy. The Republicans have traditionally have had a better plan to get this economy kicking. We need to go back. We need to stop the word compromise with the Democrat. Let's talk fiscal first, then we can deal with the social issues after we get our economy back on the right track.
Scottie Nell Hughes and Jimmy LaSalvia, we're going to have to make this a weekly appearance, if you will, because it's fun every single time. We thank you both for your time and your comments.
Thank you.
Thanks.
All right, later this hour on MidPoint, it's never nice to fool nor discount Mother Nature. And next up, your ice cream sandwich is now a permanent part of Outland. Think about that for just a minute. We'll put it all in perspective when we continue on MidPoint, where we question everything.
Hi, I'm Jean, and this is my one and only Henry. We just love scouring flea markets for special treasures. But with my type 2 diabetes, we now spend all the